Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. And today I'm really pleased to welcome our guest, Tom Wayman. Tom is from the West Kootenays, based in the Slocan Valley. Tom, it's a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tom, you're certainly one of the premier writers in our valley. Your sense of place when it comes to the Kootenays, the fact that a lot of your stories are based in the region is outstanding. Can you just give us a little bit of an insight into how many books you've published over the years, and let's just talk about that for a moment.
Oh, okay. Well, I have innumerable books of poems,
yes.
like more than 20. And then a number of years ago, well, starting in 2007, I began to do as well books of short fiction,
Okay.
and then one novel, and then my most recent book in 2015, The Shadows We Mistake for Love, is all Slocan Valley stories. They're short stories, they're fiction, but they're all set in the valley. And my most recent book of poems, which is called Helpless Angels, some of the poems are set in the valley, but mostly they're poems about music and about how our lives are, how we grow and live surrounded by music and how that affects us.
Excellent. So just tell me, what sort of motivates you to have such a strong sense of place in your books?
Well, yeah, I think, I grew up, I was born in a small mill town in the Ottawa Valley, and then raised mostly in Prince Rupert on the West Coast.
Okay.
So again, a small town, and then finished off in Vancouver. I've always been sort of interested in where we live. My background is actually journalism. When I went to UBC, we worked every summer for 4 months on the Vancouver Sun, and then we worked on the student newspaper. So over the undergraduate times, you got a lot of 12 months experience on the Sun, and so you become very aware of a community and how a community functions or dysfunctions, and so that kind of made a lot of interest. But when I moved, I taught in Nelson for 2 years in the 80s at David Thompson University Center. Then went back to Vancouver. But when I came up this last time in 1989, and I've been based in the Slocan Valley since. In a small place, community is writ large, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Because there's so comparatively fewer people, and you sort of see how a community functions, and it's harder to see in a bigger urban area. So since I was always interested in that, I think I just became more interested.
Right.
It's more transparent, if you like.
So not only do you talk about the people, but also the landscape and sort of how the two interact. And I noticed that was very well done in your books. What is your latest book?
Well, at the moment, I wanted to do another novel. The first novel, my novels are always fictionalized, sort of. They're based on autobiography, but wildly fictionalized.
Okay.
So, and the first one was a 60s novel, and was set largely in Southern California because I did graduate school there, sort of at the height of the student movement.
Okay.
And but the new novel in 1970 in Vancouver, that's when they began to develop that part of what's now called the Downtown East Side, but in those days it was called Skid Row. An area called Gastown, where they took a bunch of seedy warehouses and so on and tried to gentrify it, a project which is still going on as we speak. But the original work was all done by what they called, not all done, but mainly done by crews of what were known at the time as hippie labor. And I worked on one of those crews, and we were cheap, but we in fact didn't know much about what we were doing. So it was a pretty hilarious time, but it raised some real issues about daily work and so on. So there's a novel, again, fictionalized, but based on a particular crew and its adventures and misadventures at that time. So that's very non-Kootenay. But at the same time, I'm writing poems that are very place-based, about the landscape and the changing seasons and all those things that all of us who live in this area. It's just part of the fabric of everyday life. So. If you're the kind of writer that writes out of everyday life, you're going to involve a lot of landscape.
So your background was journalism, and then you became a poet, and then a novelist. How does that happen?
Okay, well, we were expected, the Vancouver Sun expected us when we graduated or dropped out of UBC, we would just go to work at the Vancouver Sun the rest of our lives. Okay, but for various reasons, I didn't want to do that right away, and I'd won some money. So I went to graduate school in Southern California, and the reason I went there was the director, it was a new campus of the University of California. The director was a guy who taught at UBC where I'd been studying, so they knew about him. And you had to submit work, but I later found out that they chose people to come to that graduate program on the shoes principle. And I said, well, what's the shoes principle? And they said, if you have a pair of shoes, you can come. So it was pretty wild. It was, you know, I went from Vancouver, which at that time was a sleepy provincial Canadian city, right into the height of California in the 60s. So I was in way over my head. But at the same time, of course, it was very, very exciting. But one of the things that was exciting was to discover that world of literary writing. And so I never went back to journalism, although like at the school I worked for the PR department on, you know, I've always done some kinds of writing for money in that way. But I changed my focus. The other thing is, it's hard to remember now, but in those days poetry was more important than it is now. It's never very important, but in Canada, a new book by a writer like Al Purdy or Earl Burney or Dorothy Livesey was a big deal. There would be a big interview in the Globe and Mail. They'd be on television. It was considered at that time that poetry was an art that spoke to people, that it had something to say about our common life. And so it wasn't such a big jump from journalism, which does the same thing. It presents the community to itself, to poetry. Now that seems weird, but it's just the art form has its status has not stayed constant. Let's put it that way.
So it's an evolving thing. From a writer's perspective, what's the difference between writing poems and a novel? Is it a totally different mindset?
Well, I often liken it to the difference between doing a watercolor painting, right, which you have to do more or less all at once, because it's going to run and stuff. Then it's done. And it doesn't mean you can't go back to it when it dries and fool around, but essentially, it's done. That as compared to sculpture. So poetry is very much like the watercolor painting. You can see the whole thing on the page or 2 pages, but with prose, you're constantly chipping away, and you have no idea how this is all going to work out. And you know, you make one wrong blow with the hammer and the chisel, and you haven't wrecked the piece of marble, but you've certainly made your life a lot more complicated. On the other hand, there's some lucky accidents. The marble breaks in a certain way, and you think, oh man, that's better than I could imagine. But it's also three-dimensional. You walk all the way around it. It's tactile. And it isn't that one art form is better than another. We need watercolors or oil paintings as much as we need sculpture. But it's that kind of difference is the best way I can.
That's a great analogy, and it really sort of helps you know, understand the difference. So let's just talk about your writing style. You know, you're a pretty prolific writer. You've produced a lot of material over the years. How do you go about doing that? What motivates you? What's your approach to writing? Well,
I've been lucky in ways that a lot of my peers haven't, in terms of being able to be in and out of the workforce, whether it was for many years a manual workforce or then I got into teaching, and I could teach and then go off. For a lot of my life, it was the glory days of UI, where you could, you know, as long as you had 9 weeks or whatever, you could go on UI for many weeks and stuff like that. And I had no dependents, so I could devote time, if you didn't mind, you know, not having. I never suffered, but you know, not having a lavish lifestyle. I could devote a lot of time to writing, and so got in the habit of writing a lot.
Do you write every day?
Yeah, I try to write.
Do you have a goal or a set?
Well, when I'm working on the novel, for example, I try to set four pages a day, which is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 words. So a good day, I'll just stay at it till I get the 4 pages. The poems are different. A poem, you get the idea, and if you put aside work on it, you're going to work, you know, until it's done or until you can abandon it and then come back the next day and look at it again. But so there's not the same set idea, but prose, as you know from writing yourself, it's you just have to apply yourself some every day to get it done.
Yeah.
It just won't. It doesn't happen in those bursts the way with poetry it can do it.
Interesting. So you've, as you mentioned, done a lot of teaching over the years. What is the number one advice that you give to writers?
Oh, the number one is always that chestnut. You have to read. Nobody makes music without listening to music constantly.
Right.
Nobody becomes a potter without going and looking at, sculptural pots and functional pots. Nobody becomes a painter without going to galleries and so on like that. But sometimes people have this idea, well, all right, other people can read.
Yeah.
But that's not how the arts work.
Right.
You really need to read constantly to learn,
Yes.
both learn positive things. There's a kind of writing I want to steal. They've got an idea I want to steal, a way of approaching I want to steal. And then negative things, like where you read something, you think, geez, this is really boring. And you try to figure out, okay, why am I bored?
Right.
And then I don't want to write that way.
So do you find that you're looking at different styles, different ways of writing, and sort of learning from that on a continuing basis?
Yeah, it also, like the one thing about teaching is because you're responding to student work, you're constantly thinking critically, and I don't mean negative, I just mean critically, evaluatively.
Yes.
You're weighing what works and what doesn't. The danger, now that I'm retired, the danger of not doing that is you can become very self-congratulatory with your own writing. You lose that critical mindset. So in order to keep it, you want to read widely, including reading bad things, because trying to understand, okay, why does this not work for me? That keeps it fresh in your mind. Again, like it's different with journalism, or I found it different because the goal is a lot clearer. You want, you like write bright and tight without a fight. It's gotta be smooth. Have all the facts as high in the story as possible.
And usually you're under a deadline, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Although on the Sun, I can remember that city getter yelling at me, said, "This is a daily, Wayman. Like, finish the damn story." But anyway, but the point is with a poem, you're breaking new ground. It's not clear where to go, and even with fiction now, there's so many different ways to write fiction, so it's not as clear, and you have to keep thinking, okay, what works, what doesn't work, what am I trying to do here, what am I not, and it's harder to write the formula. Some writers can, a person like Stephen King, or they can just crank them out.
Yeah.
I think some detective fiction can be
becomes like a formula.
Formula, but any kind of other kind of what they call literary writing, there is no one formula, and so where do you stand on that spectrum of, of when to introduce what information, and how much information do you give people, how much do you hold back, all that stuff.
So based on your experience and your association with other writers and so forth, from your perspective, what is this sort of the status or state of writing these days?
Well, that's an excellent question. It's I can come at it obliquely. The best way to put it is everything's in flux because of the impact of the digital world.
Right.
It's not at all clear. What is clear is that no matter what medium you're doing, you have to know how to tell a story.
Right.
Over in the West Kootenay, there's what they call screen-based industry, so people doing video games and so on. And we had people come like we have a literary festival there, and they came to our committee and said, can you guys do something on narrative? Because we've got people trying to write video games, but they don't know how to tell a story. They don't know how to create a character. They don't know how to create setting. So they just tend to reproduce a bad version of something that they've already seen. So I think that writing in the sense of preserving a story, even if it's a script for something that's going to be on the screen, it's still a human qu'il that the more you practice it, the better you are, the more you study it, the better you are. So I think it will survive that way. I also think that the demise of the book is much overstated. People found that that the book is actually quite a useful piece of technology. It's very portable. You can take it all kinds of places you can't. And as people have pointed out, like I know with some of the online books, they have the pretend pages, but most of what we read online is a scroll, right? It scrolls. And there was a reason why people gave up scrolls.
That's right.
You know, for hundreds and hundreds of years, that was books. And then they found that this other way of, this other format worked.
Yeah.
So just like radio didn't disappear when television came in, I think the book will go on, and but how much it's going to change because of the impact of the digital world, I don't think anybody knows.
Yes.
I do know that every prediction people have made about the future in my lifetime has been wrong.
Yes.
Right? I can remember when we were all going to have atomic-powered wristwatches, and I can just go on with this long list of things. Yeah. And I know in my own life, every prediction I've made about the future has been wrong.
Right.
So I don't know, you know, where we're going, but I do feel that, and I could be wrong, that literary writing will endure. It does do something that's different than what you get on a screen.
Yeah, interesting comments, because your perspective is, in my opinion, right on, because you know the book is very tactile. It's something that you can easily read, and as you mentioned, on screen we tend to scroll down very quickly and not maybe comprehend or grasp the meaning as much as we could.
And where a lot of screen stuff gives you an image, right? And as the name implies, when you're given an image, you're not using your imagination, and imagination turns out to be highly fed by reading, because you have to see the movie in your head.
That's right.
If you like. And so if you want people to be imaginative, turns out reading words is probably the best way to do that. You can move a message maybe faster with pictures, but it's also a far more limited one. I have a friend in California, actually a guy I've known since grad school, and he holds up his dictionary and says, "This is virtual reality," because everything in the world is in this little book here. And I've always liked that idea.
Let me ask you, is there such a thing as a Kootenay writer?
Well, that's a good point. Like, I think there are writers who are interested in place. They're interested in the local. They're interested in the stories about the people that surround them. Then there's writers who might live in that same locale, but that isn't what inspires them. They create imaginary worlds, or they're working on something out of their childhood, which was in a different place, a different time. I think they're all Kootenay writers, but some are more interested in representing the Kootenays or presenting the Kootenays than others. So I think it's partly geographic, but often when we say Kootenay writer, we mean someone who's writing about the Kootenays. But I think you're still a Kootenay writer, even if that's not your topic. But you still live here and participate in the community, you know, just by virtue of living in it. So that would be my answer.
Right, interesting. I just want to ask you about future projects. What have you got on your plate?
Well, like I say, I'm working on this novel about working in Gastown in the 1970s, and always I'm writing poems, and so I'm waiting to see what the new book of poems looks like. Like the last one, like I say, was all poems about the way, you know, we're the first generation ever that grew up that you could listen to whatever you want, whenever you wanted it, wherever you wanted it. No other group of people in history could do that. Now people take that for granted.
Yes.
But when I was a kid, that wasn't true. So I was interested in that. So the poems I'm writing now cover quite a gamut. And so is the book going to take the form of another, you know, extremely place-based, you know, collection of poems, or because there's some other sort of themes emerging. A lot of my books are kind of potpourri, they're mixes. So that's another option. But over the last couple of books of poems, I've liked the idea of these more thematic. You know, I did one all about the Afghan war and its effects on everyday life, and then this one about music. So I'm tempted to try to find a theme, but I have to wait a little longer, because my usual publisher, Harbor Publishing, like Howie White, who's the publisher, says, "We can't publish everything you write, Tom." and of course he's right. It just So I'm just gonna wait and see if that book eventually in a year or two takes a shape that I can direct it.
So just going to wrap this up, and I just want to ask, what has your experience been writing, working with various publishers and so forth? Has that changed over the years?
Well, it's changed in the sense that first thing is that the publishers became less and less confident about how to sell books. Like I grew up in the days of people like Jack McClellan, who had, was very flamboyant showman. He was sure he could sell books, and he did. And also at the time, there was this huge interest in Canadian literature. At that time, Canadian literature was seen as part of the national fabric. So people bought books because they wanted to know more about the place where they lived and what people were thinking. So again, that gave publishers way more self-confidence.
Right.
As things have shifted from an emphasis on let's have a country, Canada, to let's make a lot of money, which is sort of globalization.
Right.
One of the things that's happened is that the publishers have become less confident about how to sell books, who to sell books to, who reads, and there's also been a very interesting phenomenon about the reading public aging. So if you go to a reading in Nelson, it's a sea of gray hair, right? The only young people are at the spoken word stuff, and never the twain shall meet. At our literary festival in Nelson, we tried to have spoken word, but they weren't interested. I mean, they performed, but they weren't interested in coming to any other events. Like it's just a hermetically sealed world. Well, that's weird, that idea that a reading audience would age, because we started as young people when there was lots of older people, and then eventually we got old, but there was nobody behind us.
Right.
So again, what does a publisher do?
Right.
But the book of stories from the Slocan Valley, it's got a photograph of a woman on the cover, and I said, well, and the publisher, which is a branch of Harbour called Douglas and McIntyre, publisher said, Tom, only women buy fiction. And she was dead serious, so you have to have a female image on the cover. And whether that's true or not, it gives you an idea of I think the publishers really are scrambling.
Right.
Howie White, the Harvard Publishing, told me once, he said, the paradigm is changing, but we don't know what it's changing to.
Right.
And so it's definitely an industry in flux.
Right.
And
well, that even trickles down to the independent bookstore, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen a bit of a renaissance in the independent bookstore.
Yes.
And a lot of people are going back and supporting their local bookstore. Any favorite bookstores in the Kootenays?
Well, I really like Otter Books in Nelson, because it's quite an astonishing
they have an amazing
collection.
selection there.
They have an amazing selection, and they're very supportive local, but they've got everything. I think almost all independent bookstores are really a treasure to have.
And it's something that I think maybe our communities don't always fully appreciate.
No.
Yeah.
But there's other businesses too that people don't appreciate until they're gone. It's like wait a minute. But by that time it's too late. And again, not to focus on books too much. I don't think books are the only industry that are changing. Like if you look at all the troubles that the department stores have had and so on, I think the economy itself is in some senses, the paradigm is shifting and no one quite knows. I mean, you know better than this than I do, given the Business Journal. But my sense is that it's not quite clear who buys and how do you sell in the way, say, 30 years ago, people could have a lot more confidence. If we do this will sell. And so I don't think the book industry should be taken out as if it was something different than what's happening in other industries.
There's definitely a sense of flux in a lot of business operations these days. So.
If you go into the main stationery store in Nelson and you want to buy paper, to put in your printer, the choice you have is paper from China or the USA, and this is in the heart of the forest industry world. That you cannot buy Canadian paper in a bookstore, in a stationery store. Well, that's a big change, believe me. And so the whole backstory to that is, I think, again, some shift in the paradigm that where it's going and what you can, how you survive economically now. It's not just books. I think in the literary world, people like to think, oh, it's just books or bookstores. Well, it is those, but all the Canadian economy, I think, is
worldwide. I think it's a phenomenon that's happening for sure. Tom, it's been a pleasure to interview you today and talk with you. Certainly one of the recognized writers in our valley and in the Kootenays, and I certainly tip my hat to all the accomplishments that you've done and
thank you.
and the information that you conveyed to other aspiring writers as well. It's been tremendous. So thanks again for being our guest.
Well, thank you very much.
So this has been Talking Kootenay Books, and my name is Keith Powell.